Welcome in, Psych students. Professor Zeeb here, and welcome to our short lecture on retrieval and interference. We're going to start off with this gentleman, Hermann Ebbinghaus, going way back to the late 1800s for this one. And Hermann Ebbinghaus is considered to be a pioneer in the study of human memory. In other words, he conducted the very first experiments on memory. It was kind of interesting how he did it. He actually created thousands of these lists of nonsense syllables. For example, rec, jep, etc., etc. In other words, he created this gobbledygook list of words that basically had no meaning. In other words, memories were not attached to these particular stimuli, and he would time himself and record how long it would take to memorize each list of variant lengths. In other words, they would contain different lengths of lists, maybe 5 or 20, depending on the case. You have to be careful with Ebbinghaus's study here because he did use himself as a subject, which is extremely biased. So therefore, a huge no-no in research. You probably would not want to do that, but we're going to go with it anyway. One of the things he found, which is the obvious, the longer the list, the longer it took to memorize them. So obviously that is true, but I think the more important point here is that he measured how much longer it would take to memorize a long list. For example, if we look at his data here, down here at the bottom we see the number of syllables of those gobbledygook words per list, and then up here was the number of repetitions he would have to use to fully memorize that particular list. So if you look closely, if the list was about 7 words in length, he basically found that he could look at it once and memorize it fully. But if we go over here to say 30 words, so if a list contained 30 of those words, it would take him about 50 times of studying that list to fully memorize it. So yes, longer lists take longer to memorize, but he's giving it an actual value, how much longer it actually takes to memorize that list. So some other things that he found in his experiments is that memory decays rapidly. So for example, he found that he would forget about, on average, half of each list in as little as an hour. So if he went back and tested himself an hour later, he would find that he would lose on average about half of that list after he had fully memorized it. So therefore, memory is very fragile and decays rapidly. But the important message here is that, thank goodness, it does not decay that rapidly. You have to remember that Ebbinghaus was literally studying thousands and thousands of these lists. And so what we think was happening is that he was getting confused. He was getting these lists jumbled up in his memory and was confusing them, and therefore it was creating difficulty memorizing those lists. So that leads us to a very important point here, which we're going to make, and that is something called interference. Interference is one of the major reasons we forget things, and certainly in Ebbinghaus's case, it may explain why his memory loss was so great. There are 2 types you need to know. So the first one is called proactive interference. Basically what this means is the difficulty remembering recently learned information caused by previously learned information. So what that means is that old information is interfering with the recollection of new. Something you've learned previously, maybe a couple days ago, maybe creating problems coming up with something you've just memorized. So Ebbinghaus obviously experienced this as he's going to recall a new list. He may have been confusing it with a list he had learned, say, 2-3 days ago. So we know that sometimes this happens when we're trying to remember something. For example, some of you may have experienced this where if you've ever moved and someone asks you for your new address, you may have accidentally given them your old one. This would be an example of proactive interference. Once again, that old information is interfering with the recollection of the new information. Secondly, we have something called retroactive interference, which is basically just the opposite. The difficulty remembering old information due to more recently learned information. Once again, new information is interfering with the recollection of old information. Something you've learned is creating problems remembering something you've learned in the past. An example of this would be, let's say you've been studying chapters for an exam in one of your classes, and so you go to show up for the exam. Your professor walks in and says, hey, you know what, before we take the exam on those past chapters, I'm going to do a mini lecture on the next unit on the new chapters, and then we'll test you on the old information. How frustrating would that be? So that would be an example of retroactive interference, especially if that information overlapped and was very similar in some way. I think it would create confusion among the students as they're trying to remember the old information because the new information is kind of blocking or interfering, as we would say, with the recollection of the information. So in other words, these two, proactive and retroactive, may possibly potentially be reasons we forget things is because we often confuse them and mix them up. And certainly with Ebbinghaus, you could argue that was the case. So this will conclude our lecture on interference. Please progress to the next step in the class.